If you haven't seen the new movie Top Gun Maverick, I don't know why you're on this channel. You don't deserve to be here. Today, we'll discuss Dark Star, the hypersonic aircraft featured in the movie's opening. Don't worry if you haven't seen it, we'll give a light spoiler, as everything we'll discuss appears in the first 10 minutes of the movie, and it's not relevant to the plot since we're discussing engineering. I've received a lot of comments asking me to please analyze Dark Star, to see if this aircraft could really be possible, and that's what we're gonna do today. But I remind you that I already have a whole series of videos talking about hypersonic aircraft. I'll leave it for you in the description. Is Dark Star a possible option today? The short answer is no, I'm sorry, although it's true that there's been quite a bit of flirting with the idea. Even with hypersonic aircraft, the plane from the movie is quite advanced. I'm not saying it because of its geometry. In fact, the geometry of aircraft is no longer a limiting factor in their design. Since the beginning of the 21st century, manufacturing methods have advanced tremendously. So is the geometry of aircraft no longer a limiting factor? I mean, Dark Star is quite advanced. I won't tell you the reason now, but I'll reveal it at the end of the video. For now, share your guesses in the comments. What do you think can be seen in the movie that shows Dark Star as an aircraft that's much more advanced than what could exist today? As explained in the Hypersonic Topics video series, there isn't a moment. There isn't a Mach number at which you go from supersonic to hypersonic, like there is when you go from subsonic to supersonic, which is Machsnick. The physics changes radically when going from subsonic to supersonic, but the same doesn't happen when we go from supersonic to hypersonic. In fact, that change doesn't exist. It's a convention that's generally given. And some say that from Mach 3 it can already be considered hypersonic. Others say from Mach 5, others from Mach 7. There isn't a single correct answer. But if, for example, we considered that from Mach 3 it's hypersonic, we would already have an aircraft that has been operating at Mach 3 speeds, which is the Strategic Reconnaissance 71. But to be honest with you, I don't think Mach 3 is a good reference point to start talking about hypersonic speeds. I prefer to say that it's from Mach 5 onwards. I'll explain this again on the channel, as I know many of you came to this video after watching the movie but didn't know me before. So, I'm aware that many of you won't really know what it means to go at supersonic speeds. So this explanation is for you. If you like it, at least subscribe, right? When an object moves, the air in front of that object has to move out of the way so that the space occupied by the air can be taken up by the object. When you move forward, the air in front of you moves out of the way. The best example, I think, is one I gave in a lecture for the Royal Aeronautical Society in 2019. The analogy with ducks was used to help explain the topic that was being discussed. If you were in the water and some ducks approached you at a speed slower than the waves in the water before the ducks hit you, would you feel those waves coming toward you? The approaching waves would be transmitting the information to you that some ducks are approaching. What they would do is get you out of the duck's way. But if now we have some ducks that move faster than the waves, we get that triangular shape that forms. Well, if you were now in the duck's path, wouldn't you feel any wave before the ducks crash directly into you? If you notice, the water is still in front, so you would just suddenly bump into the ducks, and the ducks would push you directly. Well, that's exactly what happens in the air. When an object or an airplane moves at subsonic speeds, below the speed of sound, the air in front of its path moves out of the way before the airplane itself arrives. That's because pressure waves are generated that push it aside, but those pressure waves move at the speed of sound. So if a plane now travels at supersonic speeds, it's impossible for it to communicate forward with pressure waves that there's a plane moving. Therefore, the air in front of a plane moving at supersonic speeds doesn't feel any force and can't move aside before the plane arrives. And that's why literally the plane crashes into all the particles in front of it. That's the shockwave, the collision of the plane with the particles in front of it. Do you understand now what it means to fly at supersonic speeds and why shockwaves are generated? Whenever there is an object moving at supersonic speeds, like for example a meteorite, shockwaves will appear. And I don't like to say that from Mach 3 on it's hypersonic, because as an object accelerates more and more, for example Mach 3.1, Mach 3.2, Mach 3.3, the shockwave leans more and more and sticks closer to the object's body. And it's not really until Mach 5 that the shock wave is already very close to the body and can't get any closer. For example, if you go from Mach 1.2 to Mach 1.4, the shock wave will more or less change like this. However, if you go from Mach 5 to Mach 6, the shock wave will only change by 1 degree. Practically, it won't tilt anymore. And that's why I really like to say that Mach 5 is a good reference point to talk about hypersonic. The general public usually doesn't consider this, but those who follow me on this channel and are interested in aerospace will know it. Since many viewers have seen the movie and come to this video to learn more, I will emphasize this point. There are a lot of people who don't understand that the speed of sound depends on the air temperature. The speed of sound varies significantly and is far from constant. At sea level, where the temperature is typically assumed to be 20 degrees C, the density is 1,225. The speed of sound is typically assumed to be around 149 miles per hour. But at about 60,000 feet of altitude, which is roughly 17 or 18 kilometers, the air temperature is radically different from what we have at sea level. And in fact, the speed of sound, precisely because of that temperature change, is about 1,000 kilometers per hour. And considering that hypersonic aircraft usually fly at quite high altitudes at 60,000 feet, 70,000 feet, and so on. So, can we say that Dark Star, if it were to fly at Mach 10, where the speed of sound is about 1,000 kilometers per hour, Mach 10 would mean roughly 10,000 kilometers per hour. But please, never, ever say that the speed of sound is 1.244321 kilometers per hour, because that's not the case. Sound speed varies with temperature. It doesn't make sense to give a specific value. You can use it as a reference, but it's not a constant value. I've often seen videos on YouTube where they say, this plane flies at Mach 3. So 1.244 times 3 is I don't know what. No, the speed of sound isn't a very specific value. It's only used as a reference. Please always keep that in mind. But how crazy would it be to make a plane that could fly at Mach 10? Actually, not that much. It's surprising, but it's not that crazy. For example, in 1947 was the first time a manned plane broke the sound barrier at a constant speed. Because it's believed that probably in World War II planes diving might have broken the sound barrier. But the first time it was done in straight and level flight. It was in 1947 with the X-1, but 6 years later in 1953. They flew at Mach 2, that is, twice the speed of sound. That was with the Douglas skyrocket. Mach 3 was reached in 1956 with the X-2, and to reach Mach 4, they had to use the X-15. In 1961, this aircraft, years later, would set the record for the highest speed ever reached by humans in airplanes. Mach 6.72 in the year 1967. Pay attention. Mach 6.72. Impressive, 55 years ago. But then pay attention, because in 2004, the X-43 reached Mach 9.7. However, be careful, there's a catch here. This aircraft was unmanned. Alright, but Mach 9.7, keep that in mind. Therefore, it wouldn't be so crazy if in 2022 we reached Mach 10 right. As I mentioned, the Dark Star aircraft contains futuristic and fictional elements. I'll tell you at the end, leave your thoughts in the comments, I want to know what you think. Now, don't come telling me that during orbital re-entries you reach higher Mach numbers, like Mach 20, because that's absolutely true. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about flying straight and level, powered at a constant Mach number, whether that's 10 or close to it. In orbital re-entries, when you enter the atmosphere, you can't avoid reaching those Mach numbers, because when you're orbiting, you're going very fast. And when you start to enter the atmosphere, since you're going so fast, you reach those very high Mach numbers. Around Mach 20. But that has absolutely nothing to do with what they're trying to achieve with Dark Star in the movie Top Gun Maverick, because they're propelled at a constant speed of Mach 10. Please don't let anyone claim it's already been achieved, because it hasn't. In fact, Lockheed Martin is developing an aircraft that could be quite similar to Dark Star. In fact, 3 or 4 years ago, I remember reading on official Lockheed Martin sources on their own website things about the Strategic Reconnaissance 72, but magically those things have disappeared. It turns out that searching on the internet, I saw that about 3 or 4 years ago, Putin officially held a conference or a presentation of his new hypersonic missiles. And it turns out that from that moment, the files on the Lockheed Martin website were deleted. Talking about the Strategic Reconnaissance 72 out. Which clearly implies that this has become something secret. For example, the F-117 at the time. By the way, speaking about Lockheed Martin ScanWorks, which is the division within Lockheed Martin that is responsible for researching this type of technology. Well, in the past, they developed the U-2, the Strategic Reconnaissance 71, the F-117, the F-22 Raptor, which is flying today, and the F-35, which is also flying today. So it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that they're developing the Strategic Reconnaissance 72, which in fact I'm telling you, they are developing. Although it must be said that this aircraft will not be manned, it will be an unmanned aerial vehicle. In reality, it will closely resemble the depiction in the film Top Gun Maverick. Because, in addition, that prototype that appears in the movie was designed with the help of engineers from Skankworks. And in fact, actually, this is funny. The Chinese thought it was a real aircraft, the model they made, and they put satellites to see what the United States was building in case it was some kind of military project. So they totally fell for it pretty hard. But now, before talking about the plane, I wanted to mention something. It's completely impossible, really, completely impossible for a pilot to eject at Mach 10 like it shows in the movie. It's completely nonsensical. Fortunately, we have reports of pilots who have ejected at supersonic Mach speeds, Mach 1.2, Mach 1.3 approximately, and everyone who has ejected at these speeds has ended up very badly. Broken arms, legs, and ribs very badly. And in the movie, well, what can we say? This is because when you move at such high speeds, the impact of the air is not like the wind just blowing on you a little, right? It's a real impact. It crushes your ribs, the parts. Also, if you eject and one of your arms goes out of your body's trajectory, the air will generate an incredible resistance force on your hand. What you'll do is throw it violently backward and it would dislocate your joints. This is what has happened to all the pilots who have ejected at supersonic speeds. That at the moment when a leg, for example, came out, their entire leg would be completely broken. And that's considering that these pilots ejected at about Mach 1. Mach 1. Just imagine Mach O-N-E-0. In fact, just recently, a few weeks ago, I went skydiving, and falling at 200 kilometers per hour, the force of the wind on my hands and face was tremendous. 200 kilometers per hour. Let me remind you that in drag force, speed is squared, which means that the force you feel when you're going at 200 kilometers per hour compared to going at 600 kilometers per hour isn't 3 times greater, it's 9 times greater, okay? So imagine from Mach 1 to Mach 1.0, it doesn't make any sense. But anyway, now the most interesting part, let's talk a bit about Dark Star. What is that futuristic thing you say the aircraft has that couldn't exist today? Well, I'm sorry, but I'm not gonna show it to you in this video. No worries, the video is already up on my secondary channel, you can watch it now. I want to boost my secondary channel where I upload podcasts, as many of you may not have known about it. Interesting things related to me, related to my career, and so on. To give my channel a boost and let you all know about it, I've uploaded the second part there. For those interested in supersonic topics, I've uploaded related content in the previous days. 2 talks that I gave some time ago. One was in English for the Royal Aeronautical Society, as mentioned earlier in this video. The other was also a talk about an hour long in Spanish discussing the fundamentals of supersonic flight. Absolute madness. I recommend watching both for those interested, starting with the English version followed by the Spanish one. They generally follow that sequence. Thanks for watching. The next video is even better than this one. Here we've laid the groundwork, but the next one is where it really shines. We'll discuss Dark Star, actual hypersonic aircraft in the next video. Thanks for watching. By the way, I'll leave the link to that video here. Alright, so you just have to click here.